Welcome to this new episode of KU Pulse, the podcast. My name is Sarah Bawazir. I'm a senior lab engineer at Khalifa University. Ladies and gentlemen, you know that this year, 2025, is the year of community in the United Arab Emirates. And the unit of a community is a family. Some people are having trouble starting a family due to infertility. Today, we have with us Professor Junaid Kashir, an associate professor at Khalifa University, who will help us understand infertility and talk about solutions that will give hope to all the couples that are facing these challenges. Dr. Kashir has over 20 years of experience in reproductive science and medicine. He completed his education and obtained his PhD from Oxford University. Dr. Kashir, welcome. We are glad to have this conversation with you today. To begin with, Doctor, can you please define fertility and infertility in the classical sense and also your own definition from your 20 years of experience?
So thank you so much again for having me here. It's a very emotive topic to talk about. So I think let's start at the beginning. How do most institutions classify the concept of infertility? So a couple is classified as infertile after they have attempted to conceive following regular unprotected intercourse for a certain amount of time. This amount of time differs depending upon which part of the world you're in, but generally it's about 2 to 3 years. Now, infertility in itself, let's try to tackle that monster first. It's a huge issue, what a lot of people don't realize, and for obvious reasons, where there are more people alive and on this planet at the moment than have ever been. But people don't actually realize just how widespread this issue is. The WHO classifies this as an actual condition since 2010. And these are a little bit old figures. They probably need a little bit of updating, but there's probably more in terms of magnitude. About 1 in 5 to 1 in 7 couples worldwide will be unable to conceive. They will not be able to have children following this definition, a specific time point of regular unprotected intercourse. So it's a huge number. More than that, though, males, 1 in 5 males, will specifically will be suffering from something called subfertility, which is not just infertility outright, but they will have major issues in conceiving. Now, if you want to try to understand what are the causative issues behind infertility, it very much depends on who you speak to. So if you speak to a clinician, or if you speak to, or if you read a medical textbook, then these will essentially tell you that it's 50-50, 50% female issues, 50% male issues. But really, that's a little bit misleading. If you speak to someone like myself, reproductive scientist, or even an embryologist working in fertility clinics, the answer given will be a little bit different. So if you break down the causative factors, now this is not to say that there's one leading factor over the other. It's just what the numbers are saying. There are major female concerns. There are female fertility issues and reproductive science and medicine issues, which are actually much more pervasive, much more physically draining, such as endometriosis and PCOS, and they deserve a lot of the attention that has been given to it because these are very challenging conditions. But generally speaking, if a female or a couple rather presents to a fertility clinic and we are able to obtain the female gamete, which is the oocyte, commonly referred to as the egg, then most likely there will not be a female issue. On the other side, male fertility has usually been just associated with production of the male gamete, which is production of sperm. So failure to do this was generally classified as infertility, and this is around about 26 to 30% of cases. However, if you then further try to classify what is causing infertility at the molecular level or even at the physiocellular level, there's a big chunk of the pie which is classified as something known as idiopathic or unknown infertility. And this is attributed to about 30 to 40% of infertile cases where both gametes are being produced, everything looks fine, but for some reason, we don't know why, fertilization or embryogenesis or implantation or pregnancy is unable to happen.
So, doctor, are you saying that more than half of the cases could be because of the male infertility?
No, absolutely. Yes. So, again, I'm a little bit biased. So, there's a bit of a disclaimer there because this is the area which I work in. But if you look at the data and you start to understand the sort of pictures that we're finding, actually, the sperm factor, the sperm causative factor seems to be much, much more pervasive compared to female. So, definitely, I would say, at least in my somewhat biased experience, the major causative factor, if you combine failure of spermatogenesis with potential reasons underlying this idiopathic chunk of the pie, male factor is definitely the leading cause behind infertility.
So, doctor, before we dive into the male factor, I want you to define some of the technical terms for our audience because, as we have agreed, we wanted this to be informative for couples who are facing issues. Give us the distinction between embryogenesis, fertilization. What are the differences?
So essentially, you have at the very basic level, you have gametogenesis, which is creation of the male and the female sex cells. On the female side, you have the oocyte or eggs, and of course, you have on the male side, you have the sperm. Now, the general idea is that you need to combine one of each to be able to produce a new individual, and the combination of these two gametes, these two cells, is something called fertilization. Once you have the egg and the sperm fertilizing, then this creates a zygote. So this is a very technical term, but really it's the embryo that has been generated. And from here on in, the single cell the zygote will start dividing, multiple cell divisions. That is a process known as embryogenesis. And then implantation is the term where the embryo at a certain developmental stage attaches to the endometrium in the uterus in its mother. And from there on in, then a pregnancy is established.
So, what leads to the failure of establishing pregnancy after fertilization?
So I think there's a lot of issues, and we don't have time to cover all of them, obviously. So I think what we should try to consider are the major issues that are there. For the first major issue, of course, is failure to generate the embryo. That's one of the major causes, where either you have a failure in gametogenesis, you have a failure in fertilization, or you have a failure or improper embryogenesis. So that's one side of the coin. The second side, of course, is also then implantation. So for reasons unknown, an embryo is made but is unable to implant into the uterus. Now, there's many reasons for that as well. There's endometrial issues. There could be hormonal issues. There could be many other epigenetic or dietary or lifestyle issues as well. But I think to further narrow it down, I think we need to also speak about assisted reproductive technologies, or more commonly known as IVF, in vitro fertilization. So just to give you an idea of what IVF is essentially it's obtaining both of the gametes outside of the body and then combining them in vitro or in a dish. So there are multiple techniques that are used to use this. There's a normal routine where you basically mix the sperm with the egg and hopefully one fertilizes, that generates an embryo. That's known commonly as IVF. But there are also many more powerful techniques as well. There's something called ICSI, which is intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where a single sperm is injected directly into the oocyte. And this rectifies a whole range of issues with the sperm. And I'll break down what major issues there are with the sperm as well and how sperm is classified in the clinic. There are also many other powerful techniques where we can take a single cell, it's called a single cell biopsy, from an embryo, and we can perform genetic diagnoses on that embryo for genetic disease, for various other types of rare conditions as well. So there's a whole range of very powerful techniques that are employed under this vast umbrella. I prefer to call it assisted reproductive technologies, or ART. And it's really widely used. So just to give you an idea, that about 70 to 80% of infertile conditions can be treated by this technique. It's just anyone in Abu Dhabi or in Dubai can just drive around the city, and around every other corner, one will see a new private fertility clinic opening up a new branch. So that gives you an idea. People are opening up shop because there's a lot of demand.
Yeah.
And in some Western countries, IVF and ART is so widely used that it actually accounts for about 20 to 30% of the total birth rate of that country. So just imagine that for a minute, that 20 to 30% of an entire country began in a lab. So that's how widely used ART is. But its success story is a little bit misleading in itself as well. Yes, it's powerful. Yes, it's space age cool technology. Yes, we can treat about 70% of infertile cases, so there's definitely hope. The issue is that per treatment cycle, it's not very successful, which a lot of people don't realize. It's not some sort of magic silver bullet. In terms of pregnancy success, one round of IVF, and I'll go into what one round involves, is only about 20 to 30% success rate.
So, Doctor, let's pause a little bit
Yes.
because there are like a few things we want to unpack. First of all, why are we or globally relying on IVF? Uh, is the issue of infertility rising, or what is going on? Is lifestyle affecting fertility? Can you please
It's a
unpack this for
very
us?
complex issue, and the answer is not very straightforward, but the outcome is very clear. So the answer to that is all of the above. There are many things which are impacting this. Of course, the one obvious thing is lifestyle choices. A lot of people are leaving having children too much longer, either for various issues. I'm not going to go into these issues. Everyone has their own reasons, but that is also increasing the reliance on ART. But it's again not so straightforward. That's only the most obvious reason. It's definitely not the predominant reason. There are various causes of infertility that we talked about, but there's many things that are coming about that we're actually appreciating now. Environment has a huge effect. Diet as well, that seems to have a huge effect as well, and not just diets have an effect on fertility. A lot of studies have actually shown that the parent's diet impacts the offspring as well, and further generations to come. So there's a huge side that we're only just beginning to understand as well. But to put it into perspective, and this is again why I point to really shine the light on male infertility, there are a number of studies now that have been looking at male parameters, so semen parameters as they're called. Now, just to clarify what these are, when a male presents to a clinic, a fertility clinic, there's a few routine tests that are done. These test the shape of the sperm in terms of the cell, the size, and how it looks. That's known as the morphology. We also assess the number of the cells being produced. That's known as a sperm count. We also assess how well the sperm are able to swim, not just if they're swimming or not, but if they're able to swim in a certain direction with a certain force. So that is known as sperm motility. So all of these parameters have been monitored and recorded over the past 50 to 60 years that IVF has been around in Western countries. And what the data suggests is shocking, that over the past 50 to 60 years, all of these parameters have fallen by 60 to 70%. And multiple studies are showing this. Again, what are the causes behind this? Are people getting rid of the social stigma and they're more confident to turn up to a fertility clinic? Are we identifying more issues that we didn't know before, so more people are classified as infertile? Or are people just becoming more infertile? There's evidence for and against all of these theories, but at the end of the day, the data is what the data is. Male parameters are decreasing. People are leaving having children to a later age, and all of these are combining, and the effects are being seen now. So you look at many countries, I won't name them, but in the Far East, where the population is in terminal decline, and IVF is not able to save them.
Doctor, you mentioned an interesting point. We usually, uh, from popular culture and from our daily lives, we know that women have to eat a certain food, supplements when she's pregnant or when she's preparing to be pregnant, but we've never heard any advice for the men. What should they eat? What should they stop eating? What should they stop consuming?
I think men really should be much more careful with regards to their lifestyle. because the same way in which we're very harsh on women, you have to eat a certain thing, behave a certain way when you're ovulating or when you're pregnant. Well, the same sort of factors also affect the males as well. In fact, when I told you about these studies that are showing that diet is affecting the offspring, it's not via the female, it's via the male. These epigenetic conditions, as they're called, they're not genetic conditions. They're conditions that are influencing the embryo, the genes that are expressed. It's being influenced by the sperm. It's the sperm that are delivering these causative factors. So definitely, the type of conditions that are caused. There's of course consumption of various substances, smoking, for example, high fat diets, low protein diets. All of these are negatively impacting both gametes, but it seems to be at a much larger dominance in terms of males. So for example, there's a male condition. You remember we talked about this idiopathic chunk of the pie, this unknown reason. Well, one of the causative factors behind this is something that is specific to sperm. It's something called DNA fragmentation or DNA damage. This is where the sperm's DNA, as the name says, is damaged so much so that it's fragmented. Now, this sperm is able to fertilize. It's able to generate a embryo, but this embryo is unhealthy. And what a lot of studies have shown is that this sperm DNA fragmentation is being caused by oxidative stress. It's being caused by smoking is a major, major cause. And what we're also seeing is that a larger proportion of males presenting to the clinic present with a high proportion of DNA fragmentation in their sperm. And unfortunately, as of now, we don't have any routes to try and treat such conditions. So, just to use that as a kind of segue then to causative factors and idiopathic infertility. Now, what we're beginning to really appreciate is male infertility in itself is not just necessarily a failure of spermatogenesis. We have seen cases predominantly where sperm is produced, but it's not able to fertilize.
So what is the issue? Is it the protein?
Yes,
that you're
so
working
that's
on?
actually the protein that I've been working on. Some would say wasted my life try to figure out. But it's
Not
it's
wasted if it's
well,
helping
yeah,
people.
hopefully,
And we'll talk
inshallah.
also about the success story. But first,
Absolutely, yes.
tell us, doctor, how is this protein affecting fertility?
Yes. So, to very briefly describe it, so we talked about this process of fertilization where the sperm combines with the oocyte to generate an embryo. Well, before this joining, the oocytes or the egg and the sperm are actually metabolically, they're not very active. I mean, I know the sperm is able to swim and the oocyte is able to stay alive, but beyond that, they're not really doing much. But when the sperm fuses with the egg, it causes a 360-degree change. It goes from a relatively dormant cell type to perhaps one of the most active cell types in the body. It starts to undergo all the processes required for embryogenesis. And to cut very, very long story short, what happens is that the sperm, it delivers this protein that we've been working on for the past 20 years, 20 odd years. And this protein causes the oocyte to start releasing calcium in a very specific way. So we all know about calcium. We know that it's found in milk and we need to consume it for our bones. But it's not as simple as, oh, if you drink calcium, you'll become more fertile. Please don't increase your milk consumption. It doesn't quite work that way. But essentially, it's a major way in which cells talk to each other and the major way in which cells turn on and off particular genes. They cause calcium release. And then this has downstream effects. Now, what happens at fertilization, this PLCζ protein, it causes a very specific pattern. I kind of call it a molecular code, a molecular Morse code, that this calcium needs to be released in a very specific amount and in a very specific frequency. And each species that we've studied till date, humans included, every species has their own unique your own unique signal, sorry. And
Of the same
of the
protein.
same from the same
From the same
protein
protein.
causing a unique signal. If you use a mouse's pattern of calcium signals in a human, it's not going to fertilize. It's not going to become an embryo, and vice versa. So it's a very powerful and fundamental process. The way I like to describe it, to best use an analogy, we've all seen these dominoes, right? So you line them up in pretty little shapes, and then you just kind of touch one, and there's a domino effect. Everything falls down. Well, this is that first initial touch. If this is inefficient, everything else downstream is going to be inefficient as well.
Do we understand how it fails or how?
So there are many studies that have been done. In fact, the group I was doing my PhD with when I was in Oxford, we were the first part of the first study to identify that if the gene for this PLCζ protein is mutated, even a single change, it results in a loss of activity. It becomes inactive. It's unable to cause this calcium release. Since then we've done many studies. We found multiple mutations. I've been part of this effort, but then other colleagues from around the world have found multiple mutations. And what we've also seen in the clinic is that the sperm that is deficient of this protein, or even reduced levels of this protein, are exhibited. Then this also results in infertility. In fact, something that we published just recently is where we found that there were different levels of PLCζ that is found in the sperm. And this has always been really confusing to me. It is something that I noticed way back in the age of the dinosaurs when I was doing my PhD. But essentially, we found that there wasn't a single constant level of this protein. So we couldn't just say that, oh, sperm will have X amount of this protein.
So there's no like threshold where beyond this.
So this is what we were trying to figure out with this study. So what we essentially did was we tracked a number of couples undergoing IVF in a clinic. The couples came, they obtained the gametes, the embryologists in the clinic, and they performed the IVF to generate embryos. Once this treatment was done, we examined the sperm for levels of this PLCζ. We did multiple analyses, and I won't bore your audience with the details, but we just looked at PLCζ profiles. But at the same time, we also monitored how healthy the embryos were. So we were looking at specifically something called time-lapse imaging, where, I mentioned that during embryogenesis, you're getting these multiple cell divisions. Well, a lot of studies have found that if we track the rate of these cell divisions, we can get an idea of whether the embryo is going to be healthy or not. So if these cells are dividing too fast, that means it's struggling. It's trying to compensate for something. It's metabolically overactive. Or if it's dividing too slow, then it's going to struggle. So all of these parameters correlate to unhealthy embryogenesis. So embryogenesis needs to be in a certain rate, a certain time of divisions. So what we found was in all of the embryos that we looked at the how should I put this? We looked at the ideal cell division rate. And we found that all of the embryos that fit into this ideal good window of cell division had the highest levels of PLCζ in their sperm that resulted in these embryos. But what we also did was like, okay, so that's the healthy picture. What's happening in the non-healthy? Why is there any relationship between all the embryos that are unhealthy and the PLCζ in the sperm that generated them? So we looked at all of the embryos that were either dividing too fast or dividing too slow. And what we found that the level of this PLCζ protein in the sperm was always below a minimal level. For now, it's an arbitrary value, but there is a threshold that a minimum level of PLCζ in the sperm is required to effectively fertilize and give good embryogenesis. So when we looked at all the unhealthy embryogenesis, and we found this threshold, we then kind of did the other way around. We said, okay, let's set a threshold of PLCζ at this level. And then let's say all of the cases below this level and all of the cases above this level at fertilization. Let's see what happened to the pregnancy. So when we looked at all of the cases where the sperm protein was below this threshold, pregnancy success was about 20 to 30%.
With IVF or natural?
With IVF. So this is with this facilitation. And remember what we talked about right at the beginning? Global success rate at the moment is about 20 to 30%.
And that's why you called it inefficient, right?
That's why we called it inefficient, yes. Now, what was really exciting was when we looked at all of the cases where the sperm PLCζ protein was above this threshold, pregnancy success was about 50 to 60%. So almost double the current success rate. So before this, we'd always thought that, well, maybe PLCζ deficiency was for a select type of male infertility, where PLCζ is deficient. And it's still a sizable number. It's about 5,000 to 6,000 couples just in the GCC region per year. But what this data suggests that actually if we use PLCζ as a diagnostic and a potential route for treatment, we'd be able to increase the success rate across the board for all couples that are attending IVF. Because one of the major reasons that IVF is unsuccessful is something called abortive embryogenesis, where the embryo is made, but it doesn't develop that well and essentially is unable to implant. So actually, we were working with a leading private fertility clinic here in Abu Dhabi, where we applied one of these findings, where we thought, okay, well, what is PLCζ doing? It's causing these oscillations, calcium release within the oocyte. So can we at least use that principle? Because at the moment, what we're trying to do is develop a therapeutic that is based around this protein. It's easier said than done. Everyone, this has been the holy grail for about 20 years or so. But it's been proving to be very challenging.
So you're designing a diagnostic test?
Yes.
And then you have a treatment plan.
So the diagnostic test, yes, we've got, we've got a couple of PhD students working on this. We've made significant progress as well. We're also finding correlations between this PLCζ and that DNA fragmentation issue, the story that we were talking about. But on the treatment side of things, actually, is something that we're immensely proud of. Where we worked with this leading fertility clinic, private clinic within Abu Dhabi, where we came across a case where this couple was infertile despite having multiple IVF treatments for 2 to 3 years. And upon further examination of the male's genome, they found that this guy had a mutation in the PLCζ gene. So we thought, okay, well, is there any way, because it's going to be a while before a PLCζ therapeutic comes along, so can we come up with some sort of way to help this couple? And based upon this knowledge, based upon this finding that, well, okay, levels of PLCζ means that there needs to be a certain level of calcium release as well, we came up with a specialized protocol. And really, there is a little bit of secret sauce in there, which I'm not at liberty to disclose at the moment. But generally, the chemicals that we use, the combinations and the protocols that we use, these are all FDA approved. These are all actually used in very specific cases within the clinic as well in other applications. But we basically generated a protocol based upon this chemical, on the fact that there wasn't any protein in the sperm, and the PLCζ gene was mutated. And we applied this protocol.
And the mutation caused it to not release the right signal.
Yes, because this mutation inactivated the protein essentially. It's amazing. It's a single change that inactivated the entire protein. So we applied this protocol to this couple, and alhamdulillah, we found all of the eggs that we fertilized. I think four out of five. I think about 90% of eggs that we fertilized have now developed into embryos, and we're hoping that soon we'll be able to transfer these embryos into the recipient mother, and hopefully she'll be able to become pregnant. So it's absolutely amazing. It's as a scientist, it's very rare that you see your research directly being translated and helping couples in the clinic. And alhamdulillah, I've been able to see that multiple times. I've been able to track my research to specific cases of children being born. Alhamdulillah, so it's very rewarding, absolutely.
Dr. Kashir, I hope we will hear more success stories from your work and collaboration with clinics in Abu Dhabi and inshallah worldwide. I want to ask you, how do you see the future of fertility? What will be treatment, maybe something you're working on if you can share, or some things that you're excited about?
Well, I think there's very much so exciting times ahead. I think that, we went into a little bit of a depressive note when we talked about that it's not very successful in terms of per cycle percentage success. But really, that means there's a whole lot of room for improvement. And while the study that we recently published was a major advance, it's one of many advances that are being made. As we understand reproductive physiology more, as technology becomes much more accessible, I really think what you want about IVF and ART and reproductive science in general, it's here to stay. And definitely the sort of numbers that we talked about in terms of increasing reliance on ART, or the increasing need of ART, I think definitely it's going to increase in popularity. It's definitely not going anywhere. But I think that the kind of success stories that we begin to hear of, where clinical intervention, such as the one that I just described, where you had a couple that was trying for 2 to 3 years, nothing was happening, but then all of a sudden the science advanced, the scientists and the clinicians came together, banded together, and produced this novel treatment. There's many such cases that are coming about. So I think that's one aspect that I'm very excited about. I think that as technology and science understanding increases, so do the routes for potential successful treatment. But what I'm mostly excited about, especially in this region, are the changing social attitudes. I really think that people are becoming much more open to discussing such issues. I think people are realizing that there are routes for treatment, and I really hope that through this episode, people will also further communicate and understand that, well, it's kind of like any other disease. You get a cold, you take some ibuprofen or you take some Panadol. The same thing with this. It's not the end of the world. It is devastating when one finds out that one cannot conceive. In my own family, I am personally affected by this. I have 3 kids, by the way, all naturally conceived. So, you never know what's going to happen. So there's no reason to lose hope just because one gets such a diagnosis. There's a route for treatment. There are improving routes for treatment as well. And what I'm very excited about is that as a society in the UAE, but in the GCC region in general, this is being discussed more in the open. And definitely in the classes that I teach, you can see that the students are much more receptive to this. And I think students are a reflection of the future of this country. And I think the future is bright, definitely. But one thing which I will say is, we really need to break this stigma in society where if a couple is diagnosed as infertile, automatically as a society we assign blame on women. As we talked about, that is not the case. The vast majority of cases are caused by underlying male issues. So everyone who's listening to this, you have been told, you have my permission to correct people. So definitely, I think that once we start educating, once we start appreciating the causative factors, I'm really excited by how, as a society, this will cause further improvement and accessibility to this technology as well.
Thank you, Dr. Junaid, for the informative episode.
Thank you for having me.
Our audience, we hope you learned a lot in this episode and you gained hope. There are multiple protocols and treatments that are being pioneered, specifically here also in Abu Dhabi. And one thing that I've learned that men have also a role in healthy pregnancy. They need to adopt a healthy lifestyle, eat well, exercise, stop unhealthy habits. Thank you for joining us again and see you in another episode.